Okay, so this is a continuation from the Conceptual Framework Lesson 1 in the Visual Arts lecture series. We're going to put the theory of the conceptual framework into practice. So we're going to use the conceptual framework and the 4 agencies that we have previously discussed to view an artwork. As you are following along with me, I would like for you to take notes about the artwork in your journal against each agency. It's important for you to form your own interpretations and ideas and to write these down too. So the artwork that we're looking at is this one here. This is The Young Family by Patricia Piccinini, and it was produced in 2002 and early 2003. Before we go any further, I want you just to take a moment to look at the artwork. You can pause the slide in a second. And I want you just to take a moment to look at the artwork. I want you to think about what is your immediate response to this work. I want you to think about what it makes you think, what it makes you feel, what kind of things come up for you, what does it remind you of? And I want you just to jot that initial visceral reaction down in your journal. Okay, so looking at the artwork as an agent, so as its own separate entity, we're going to look at what we can observe in this artwork. So the first thing we know is that it's titled The Young Family, which gives us a bit of information about the subject matter that is being represented. It was made in 2002 and early 2003, so we have a bit of a sense of the kind of time period it was created in. And as the title suggests, this artwork represents what appears to be a mother and her young as the subject matter. The Young Family is a sculpture. It's made out of a combination of materials, including silicon, fiberglass, and human hair. The work can be described as hyperrealistic in nature. In fact, that's the genre of work. It appears very lifelike, except for the fact that it's kind of this grotesque hybrid creature, which we know doesn't exist in the real world. This could lead to feelings of disgust or repulsion from the audience as they recognize those humanistic elements, which are combined with animalistic features to create what might be described as an anthropomorphic hybrid creature. However, we can also consider the pose of the creature. It's quite passive and it displays a sense of helplessness. We can recognize that kind of fetal position with what appear to be very human legs and human arms and the way they're kind of curled up, and she's sort of, hunched forward and curled forwards, which tends to be a pose of vulnerability. So that can invite from the viewer a sense of pity when they start to really think about what they're seeing in front of them. The babies also symbolize the similarities between animals and humans, as both humans and animals nurture our offspring. So we can kind of connect to this idea of mother that we're seeing in this work. This can create a level of empathy with the audience, which is deepened by the very human-like face on the child scene on the left-hand side, which you'll get to see in more detail on the next slide. The human-like verisimilitude of the skin, along with the pig-like representation of the teats and ears, symbolize a response to new and troubling developments in biotechnologies and genetic manipulation, where scientists were experimenting with growing human organs on animals in labs. So we're seeing the artist start to respond to technologies that are occurring in her lifetime, and she's responding to those technologies. She's starting to question the bioethics of science and technology. I want you to take a moment to think about what elements and principles of art can be observed in this piece. And just to list them down and to consider how you might describe them. Obviously, you won't talk about all 14 of them, but you might consider which ones are most applicable in this instance. I would also suggest that probably pulling up a larger image, so you can Google the artwork to see it in more detail. It might be helpful for you. In addition to observing elements and principles, also consider the aspect of materiality, which is what materials the artist has used and how they contribute to the meaning of the piece. So the question here for you is, how does the use of real human hair add a layer of meaning or complexity to this artwork? This is the close-up of the baby that's seen on the left-hand side, and you can see here that its pose, lying on its back with its feet in its hands, the very nature of having hands and feet, a torso, and then the facial features, everything about this child is very human, except for the ears and then the little teats down its own chest area or torso. Under the artist agent, we're going to consider who's creating this work. So our artist is Patricia Piccinini. She is a contemporary Australian artist, and she works across a range of media, including drawing, photography, sculpture, and video works. As an artist, her practice crosses the boundaries between animals, humans, and other biologically engineered species, often blurring the lines between the real, imaginary, and scientific. Piccinini was influenced by research at the time into biological engineering and cloning that was being done by scientists. Her artworks also contain a dreamlike quality and can have been described as having ties with surrealism. The creature in the young family has certain similarities to the dead creature that is seen in Salvador Dali's The Persistence of Memory. And I'm sure you're familiar with that one. It's the painting of the melting clocks, which was painted during the Surrealist movement in the 1920s or late 19 teens. In the foreground of that image, there's a creature on the ground that it's quite difficult to kind of recognize what kind of a creature it is, but there's a reminiscence of that creature and Piccinini's creature in this work. The artist draws her inspiration for this work from science and scientists' plans to begin breeding genetically modified pigs to provide a replacement for organs and insulin-producing cells for humans, thus helping to alleviate the shortage of human organs needed for transplants and for treating diabetes. The artist is not aiming to cast a judgment on these practices, but rather raising questions regarding the ethical implications of creating a new life purely for the service of humans. The work blurs the distinction between emotion and rationality. For the viewer, it elicits a range of complex issues and dilemmas that would arise if this became real life and not just science fiction. Piccinini is influenced by the scientific world, by pop culture and art history. She likes to draw upon the mystery and mystique behind science and investigate the duality between science and art. In the audience agent, we can look at the artist's intentions of questioning the boundaries of biological engineering and cloning, and how she conveys this through the hyper-realistic appearance of the creature, which invites the audience to interrogate this strange new world of artificial or mutant beings derived from experimental biotechnology. By creating these creatures that are so lifelike and so realistic, there's that element of both disgust and curiosity that we feel that, what if a creature like this could exist? Piccinini attempts to ask her audience to question the consequences of biological engineering. An objective audience would relate to this work in a different way to a subjective one. And what I mean by that is that someone who relies on life-saving transplants or insulin that could be produced through this kind of biological engineering is possibly going to look at this work in a very different light than someone who doesn't rely on those medical advancements or that technology. It would also be viewed very differently by someone who was very passionate about animal welfare and animal rights, such as a vegan, for example. The audience at first glance is most likely to be very disturbed by this creature. This artwork can be described as abject art, which is art that provokes a response of disgust. It's art that unsettles and makes you feel uncomfortable. This artwork has a very grotesque appearance, and by hybridizing humans, which are recognizable and something that we're familiar with animals, and creating a creature that's neither animal nor human, there's kind of this feeling of unease that can be drawn upon. However, when we start to recognize the similarities this creature has with humans, and we begin to think about the purpose of this creature, we might start to feel pity or empathy for the sorrowful creature. This artwork was first exhibited in the Australian Pavilion in the Venice Biennale in 2003. It's often exhibited in major contemporary art galleries. One thing to think about is how might a female audience respond differently to this work than a male one? Have a think about in what ways a female audience might view this in a different manner, and justify your reason. So through the world agent, we're going to consider the context that's both influencing this work, but also the world that Piccaninny is representing in her work. We know she was influenced by the world of science and biotechnologies. She was inspired by the idea of an artificial world merging with reality, and her own personal fantasy of what the future could be if we continue to progress in biological engineering. From the 1970s onwards, there has been massive technological leaps made in the areas of biotech and genetic engineering, from the first ever test tube baby to cloning, to actually growing cells and stem cells in labs. And so what Piccaninny is trying to represent here is a world in which this becomes commonplace. And then she's encouraging us to ponder the ethical questions of how we can modify animals for our own gain, of how we attempt to kind of take this creature that exists in nature and turn it into something that is just a mere product. The young family portrays Piccaninny's imagining of a creature bred purely for organ transplants. During the time of creation, scientists were trying to do exactly this with pigs. So the artist uses features reminiscent of pigs in her work. Yet this creature has children that it loves and nurtures. This is a side effect beyond the control of humans, yet one we have to contend with. In her artist statement, Piccaninny says, "Over the years, various technologies, especially medical ones, have really changed our idea of what it means to be human. During this time, ideas about our impact on and responsibilities towards our environment have also evolved. It used to be that we defined technology as that which we control, and nature that which we cannot, but we would like to tame. These definitions do no longer apply. Our attitude changed under the influence of technological progress. Nature has gone from being the uncontrolled wild to being a resource to be exploited." And I think that final word there, exploited, is really the key to her message in this work of, when we can modify animals for human gain, is it exploitation? And she said herself that she's not attempting to place a judgment on that, but just asking her audience to consider the ramifications and the ethics of doing exactly that. So at this point, we've looked at the conceptual framework. We've kind of unpacked those four agencies: the artwork at the center, the artist who created it, the audience that responds to it and views it, and the world in which it is created and the world it represents. We've taken a look at an artwork and considered all those contextual elements that help to create the meaning of that artwork. And so what I want you to do now is I want you to apply this conceptual framework to your own case study artist. So using the artist for your case study and the conceptual framework agencies of artist, artwork, audience and world, I want you to create a chart of detailed notes using the guiding questions shown in the previous video, which you should already have notes for. You'll only need to do this for one artwork for this task. And at this point, you have already researched your artist, so you should have most of this information on hand. If you get stuck at any point, obviously refer back to those questions and try and answer as many of them as you can. Don't forget as well the PDF handout that I made available to you in the previous lecture. Your notes can be presented to me in class, and if you have any questions or any queries or any concerns or anything doesn't make sense, please come and see me. Finally, I have for you a glossary of important terms. They've ended up a bit messed up on this slide, but these are just some words that are worth having. Most of them are in the SCASA syllabus for visual arts. Some of them aren't, but I've added them because they're good words to have in your repertoire. And if you don't know these words, then go and look up the meanings of them, either in the glossary or online. So the first one is representation. So we're considering how things are being represented, what kind of ideas are being suggested about the subject matter, and how that representation is constructed. We're looking at attitudes, and closely linked with attitudes are values. We're looking at contexts, and as I said in the previous video, we're looking at the historical, the cultural, the social, and the political contexts. We're considering semiotics, or the language of visual communication, that system of signs, signifier and signified. We're considering materiality, which is the artist's use of specific materials to embed meaning in their practice. Another key word is abstraction, which is kind of reducing recognizable or representative artworks into more abstract, for want of a better word. Aesthetic, which has to do with the nature of things appearing pleasing. Conceptual, which is the ideas behind art. Art practice, and we will actually look at the concept of art practice a little bit further on in another video. Contemporary. Appropriation, which is taking art and recontextualizing it. And postmodern. And we'll look at postmodern a little bit more in more detail when we look at the frames, and in a later video when we actually do a bit of a deep dive on postmodern concepts. I had to think about that one. I'll leave you with some of the sources that I have drawn on for these videos. You can access all of these in the notes below the video, if you want to go and have a read of them in any more detail. As always, please let me know if you have any questions, and I'll see you in the next video.